The only way in which we can protect ourselves, I believe, is by having not machine guns and rifles, but the most sophisticated scientific weapons that we can devise. And I put nuclear weapons in that too, and anything else which will enable one man to hold off 100.
This is where we hold them! This is where we fight! This is where they die! And these shields, boys!
I need you people would believe.
Help me shake me, I'm all shook up. Psychomaniac into bread. Shoot it up, now shoot it up. Shoot it up. Shoot it up. Shoot it up. Teenage crime now, fashion's dead. Shoot it up. There goes my love, rockin' red. Shoot it up. 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 I don't see no giving head. Shoot it up, now shoot it up. There goes my love, rocket red. Shoot it up, now shoot it up.
Then when you get the money, you get the ammo.
Shoot it up. Ultra-violence in Japan. One copy, you better thank your man. Shoot it up. Shoot it up. Shoot it up. Shoot it
With a rising China, a retreating US, an assertive Russia, our strategic environment is, to say the least, changing rapidly. My next guest suggests that with this global uncertainty, it may be time for our defence community to begin contemplating that unthinkable option, a nuclear-armed Australia. Now, how bad would the situation have to get for Australia to really consider spiking the moat with nuclear weapons, and how would we even get our hands on them? Dr. Stephan Fruhling is the Associate Dean of the College of Asia and the Pacific at the ANU, and his article in the most recent edition of Australian Foreign Affairs magazine is titled A Nuclear Australia, Contemplating the Unthinkable Option. Stephan, welcome to LNL.
Good evening.
Stephan, what would you see as the main forces that would drive Australia to begin thinking the unthinkable?
Well, I think the forces that are driving Australia to think in that direction, and I think Australia's not alone in that at the moment, is just the pace and the uncertainty of change in our strategic environment. We've got a return of great power conflict to the really center stage of international security concerns since about 2014, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine and increased Chinese assertiveness in the South China Sea. We've got increasing questions about the future strategic priorities of the United States and the reliability of the United States. And I think that this is kind of expanding the arc of what people think might be credible contingencies and situations in which we might find ourselves over the next 20, 30 years.
Nuclear technology, of course, has changed substantially since Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. There are You can go much bigger with thermonuclear, or you can go quite small with tactical nukes. Tell us about the range on offer.
Well, yeah, that's correct. Nuclear technology obviously has evolved just like any other technology. Basically, there remain two basic types of nuclear weapons: fission warheads, which are the traditional atomic bomb, if you like, and then thermonuclear weapons, or the hydrogen bomb, which is a stage design and opens that much greater yield spectrum. What kind of weapons a country is seeking obviously depends on what they want to achieve with these. The traditional nuclear powers have often relied on thermonuclear weapons because they're a lot cheaper if you produce them en masse. Other countries could satisfy their needs, if you like, with much simpler designs. I think that starting with the technology, if you consider what might happen if an industrial country like Australia, but also Japan or South Korea or even Germany, where similar nascent debates are rumbling these days, is though probably starting it from the wrong end. Australia is an industrialized country and could certainly, if we wanted to develop simple nuclear warheads, the question is what might actually drive us to that situation.
I'm thinking of one situation that you mentioned in dispatches, and that is nuclear proliferation in Indonesia. That might be the strongest rationale for us to get one of our own.
Yes, that's correct. I think if we look at threats to Australia over the last few decades, where we have most thought that we have to rely on our own capabilities to manage, it's really Indonesia that's been the focus of this, going back to the West Papua conflict in the late 1950s, confrontation and so on. Should Indonesia ever acquire nuclear weapons, and I don't think that there's any indication that they're contemplating this, I think that would pose very significant problems and dilemmas for Australia. But I think the reverse is also true. If Australia, and there are some that argue that we should take this quite seriously, consider developing nuclear weapons, the same incentive would there be for Indonesia to follow suit. And I think that the net effect for Australia wouldn't necessarily be positive in that case. So I think the interdependence between Indonesia and Australia is also a strong disincentive for Australia to actually go down that route, which doesn't necessarily exist in other regions. If you look at Northeast Asia, for example.
People automatically assume that nuclear weapons are inordinately expensive, but they're in fact much cheaper than what we used to call boots on the ground. And I remember Eisenhower, I think it was Eisenhower, talking about how you get more bang for your buck with a nuclear weapon.
That's true, and I think that that's not necessarily the way that people would think about nuclear weapons these days. But obviously, if you're a small country, there are only military forces so large that you can field. The overall cost of nuclear weapons would not be prohibitive. If you look around the world, I mean, Israel developed nuclear weapons in the 1950s when it was a much poorer and smaller country than Australia. South Africa developed nuclear weapons. So in that sense, the financial cost, although substantial, would be on the order of the financial cost of other major defense expenditure that we're already committed to.
Now, I share the views of the majority of listeners in hoping to hell that we don't need them and don't get them, particularly at a time when there are still strong campaigns, strong international crusades to get rid of the damn things entirely.
No, and I think that's a fair assumption. That I think the likelihood that Australia would ever take that step, and even the likelihood of Australia being in a situation where we would seriously contemplate this, remains fairly low. A lot of things would have to happen. I think we would have to genuinely feel under existential threat by a great power from Asia. That is not yet the case. I think we would have to had made a genuine attempt at trying to draw closer to the United States and its nuclear arsenal. We haven't really done that yet. we would have to decide that that threat is much more significant than the threat that might arise from Indonesia following suit. So there's, I think, a whole series of things that would have to happen for this to become a credible possibility, which overall mean I think it's actually less likely for Australia to acquire nuclear weapons than for other countries. If you think about Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, which are much in a much more contested neighborhood. But I think if you look at the development of our strategic environment over the next 20, 30, 40 years, we probably have to conclude that it is changing at a pace where we can't quite as comfortably exclude that we might find ourselves in that kind of situation as we probably would have done 5 or 10 years ago.
Stephen, how did China's first atomic test in '64 change Australia's perspective?
Interestingly, not as much as we feared at the time. If you go back to those years, there were already a lot of concerns about the reliability of U.S. security guarantees. But ultimately, a lot of that faded away as we realized that China's ambitions were not at that time to kind of dominate East Asia or export the revolution in the way that we feared they would or they did in the 1950s. And I think it goes to the question of what are nuclear weapons for? China developed nuclear weapons primarily because the United States and the Soviet Union had threatened it with nuclear attack in order to coerce it over a range of issues, whether that was Taiwan or Korea. And the Chinese felt that they had no means of balancing that nuclear pressure. That is one kind of like incentive to develop nuclear weapons. Other countries have developed nuclear weapons in order to forestall a major conventional attack. I think that the question of what Australia would seek to achieve with nuclear weapons, even if our strategic circumstances deteriorate significantly, is another one of these questions which bear thinking through. And I think, again, the range of possibilities where it would be credible for Australia to acquire them probably boil down to a few scenarios. Indonesia is one. And as I said, probably a situation where we might find ourselves alone confronted with an overwhelming conventional threat of the type that we faced in 1942. I think that is probably one of the few other credible situations, unlike others that have been sometimes advanced, such as a breakdown of the non-proliferation regime elsewhere, but which wouldn't really touch us directly.
Australia signed the ANZUS Treaty in, 1951, to deal with threats from great powers that it would otherwise be unable to repel, bringing us under that US nuclear umbrella. What would a nuclear Australia mean for our defence relationship with the US?
That is a good question, and I think that is one of the big imponderables in this situation. At the moment, and essentially since the 1960s, the United States has been very much opposed to any of its allies acquiring nuclear weapons, to the point that these days you would have to choose between being in alliance with the US or acquiring a nuclear arsenal. And as long as that remains the case, the cost of acquiring nuclear weapons in strategic terms would be far too great for that to ever be a real option. We would lose access to US intelligence, to US technology, to US training, to all the things that help our defense force and still make it one of the most capable south of China. But there's nothing really preordained about that. I mean, if you go back to the 1950s, the Americans were much more comfortable with their allies acquiring nuclear weapons. And the US are allied in Europe with both Britain and France, which maintain their own nuclear arsenals. So I think as the United States also rethinks its role in the world and might want to reduce the strategic burden of its alliances, it's not inconceivable that the US might, as part of this, also look more favorably upon allies developing their own nuclear arsenals and therefore carry a greater burden of their own defense.
Have you given much thought to the notion of a, shall we say, a well-armed but neutral Australia?
Well, this is certainly one of the ways in which the possibility of nuclear weapons has been traditionally discussed in the Australian defence discourse, or at the fringes of the Australian defence discourse. And it all goes back to the question of what we think are the main threats to Australia. I mean, are we threatened because we are in alliance and therefore might want to withdraw from the alliance and do so in a manner that still kind of gives us the ability to repel major threats? My personal opinion is that we're less likely to see the alliance in those terms in coming decades, and more as ultimately something that still helps us deal with strategic change in Asia. If the alliance ended, if the United States maybe wanted to withdraw some of those guarantees, we might end up in a similar situation. But ultimately, I think the fading of an alliance would be gracefully. There would probably never be a point where somebody tore up a piece of paper, but you might lose confidence over time and de facto drift apart.
Meanwhile, of course, Pine Gap makes us a target for incoming missiles. But Stephen, thank you for that, Dr. Stephan Fruhling. His very provocative article in the most recent edition of the Australian Foreign Affairs magazine is titled Nuclear Australia, Contemplating the Unthinkable Option, and it's published by Black Ink.
Hold! Give them nothing, but take from them everything!